Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to be here in Brazil, one of my favorite countries. Sou brasileiro atutado. I live a part of the year here in Brazil, and I've been spending a lot of time thinking about Brazilian problems, although that will not be the gist of my talk. How to open?
Try to right arrow.
Yes. Okay, yes. Well, if we take internet and pessimism and remember George Orwell, then Orwell thought that technology would enable Big Brother to watch us, that it would facilitate the control of government. But it doesn't only facilitate social control, but also it facilitates horizontal individual contacts, as we can see very well with social media, which is basically bypassing the controllers in modern society. But here I'm not going to discuss that as much as how we can use the internet to advance the cause of liberty, because I think the internet is a great source, indeed a fountain of freedom-loving arguments. And there are many internet resources if you are interested in advancing the cause of liberty. There is the Cato Institute, there is the Atlas Network, there is the Heritage Foundation, always a very good website, the American Enterprise Institute, the Hoover Institution, the Institute for Humane Studies with a lot of very interesting films that I used, for example, in my teaching. I teach political philosophy at the University of Iceland, and I'm always on the lookout for resources that will make the teaching lively. The Liberty Fund e-books are wonderful as well, and there is a website that Angus Matheson had. He is a late professor of economics, where he has statistics about GDP and GDP per capita and population from the birth of Christ to today. And it's very interesting to browse in that website, and many things that appear there. Then there is one of my favorite sites is the Federal Reserve Board of St. Louis. They have a very good economics research department. Eurostat, the European Statistical Office, OECD, the World Bank, the IMF, and the Economic Freedom Index that I'm going to discuss shortly here. That has wonderful, in my opinion, treatment of the case for liberty. And then blogs by leading liberal thinkers like Posner. Unfortunately, his partner in the blog, Gary Becker, has just passed away. But people like Neil Ferguson and Matt Ridley, they also blog occasionally. And if I would choose two very interesting, creative, active thinkers today that always have something to contribute to the discussion, I would say that those two are Matt Ridley, the English zoologist, whose book, The Rational Optimist, is really one of the best books that have been published this decade. And then the Scots historian Neil Ferguson, who has produced a lot of TV series. In my opinion, those two are, of those of middle age, the most creative thinkers advancing the cause of liberty, much more so than many of the rather technically orientated economists that we see around. And since I'm discussing Ridley, I would like to present you with a few of his graphs that I read this book, and I'm editing it, the Icelandic translation, and I went to the internet and got to the sources of some of his graphs, and they are extremely interesting, and they cause us to be much more optimistic than we occasionally are. For example, if you look at it, we are really living in the 20th and 21st century in a golden age. Take, for example, from 1820 to 1995, how world production really went up. It's astonishing to see this. This comes from Angus Matheson. And the GDP per capita from the birth of Christ to 2003. Just look at those numbers. It is about $500 per year in $1990 until the end of the 19th century, and then you see how fast it grows. How prosperity has really become not the exception but the rule in the world. And this is a world average in the 20th and 21st century. These are marvelous figures and give us cause for optimism. And if you look at another thing that Matt Ridley points out is that violence has been greatly reduced. This is the homicide rate in Europe per 100,000 inhabitants, and it was in the Middle Ages quite high as it is in some Central American countries, as was pointed out this morning. But now it has gone in Europe to very low levels. In my own country it's actually 0.3%, and the average in Europe is about 2%, and in the US it's about 5%, I believe. And one thing that we sometimes do not notice, the good news that we do not realize, is the importance, for example, of access to clean water. Now, if you look at the US deaths per million of water-related diseases, malaria, typhoid, and paratyphoid fever, then it's very interesting to see how malaria has gone down, because we've got clean water, and typhoid. You know, the very improvement in the quality of life by having access to clean water in most countries of the world. This is one of the most important improvements in our living standards. And then, because there's so many people, and the doomsday people say that we have a population explosion, and that things are getting out of hand, that we are facing a catastrophe. We see that we are actually now escaping the Malthusian trap, because the rate of natural increase of population has been going down recently. And we see that a lot of these government measures, for example, undertaken in China, they were not necessary. Because if you look at Sri Lanka on the one hand and China on the other hand, the rate of natural increase of population has been about the same reduction in both countries, but at the cost in China of a lot of tragedies, because some people want to have many children and other people do not want to have many children, and they should be free to choose about it. But the demand for children go down when you have other opportunities, consumption opportunities, and do not have to insure yourself like you do with many children. So the natural development is this way, which is very interesting. And then another thing, because all the doomsday prophets, they said that there was famine was by the end of the corner, so to speak. If we just look at those figures, the area that is used to produce cereals on the one hand, and then the production of cereals on the other hand. And we see this extraordinary increase in the productivity of the earth. This is something which is, I think, a very strong argument for us to unleash the creative powers of capitalism to do so. Well, my old mentor, Milton Friedman, he once said to me that he, of course, valued freedoms for its own sake, but he said, our case will probably be hopeless if we couldn't show all the benefits, all the material benefits of freedom. That's what makes the case strong for a lot of people. And a powerful demonstration of the material benefits of freedom are to be found in the Index of Economic Freedom that I mentioned before, and which is accessible on freetheworld.org. Very interesting stuff. And I will just go briefly through it. Freedom and living standards, if we divide the economies of the world into 4 quintiles, and then we see that the living standards are by far the highest in the freest economies and lowest in the unfreest economies. And I can't think of a clearer, really, confirmation of Adam Smith's thesis in The World of Nations than this graph here. Because basically, he was a philosopher and was discussing this from the point of view of political economy. He didn't have the data, he was observing what he saw around him. But here we have the data to confirm this. And it also stimulates economic growth, even if the freest countries are the richest countries as well, the economic growth is highest there than they are in other countries that are less free. If we divide economies into quintiles, and the freest ones are there with the longest column. And life expectancy is also highest in the freest economies. And then I wanted to turn to a similar but distinct subject, which is this. Most of the foes of capitalism, they discuss the United States of America as an example of the bad aspects of capitalism. Now we can recognize, of course, that the US is not a paragon of virtue in terms of liberty. It is not really as free a society as it should be. But nevertheless, it is freer than many other societies, and the US bashes, I think, are wrong in many ways about it. They say that, for example, Europe, and I read this quite frequently here in Brazil, that Europe has developed a much nicer society than the US, and it's much better to live in the European societies than in America. This is what is frequently asserted. But it is very interesting to look at this in the right way, to pick the right statistics, and you do that from the internet. And what I did, for example, I divided sort of this Western world, which is under discussion, into 4 clusters. One of them is the cluster to which Iceland belongs, and that is the EEA and Switzerland. EEA is Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein, and then Switzerland is in a similar status. And then the 50 states of the US, then the 10 provinces in Canada, and then the 27 states in the European Union. These are 4 clusters, and I checked out what is the living standard like in those clusters on average. I calculated this. This is the living standard on average in the EU. This is the living standard on average in the 10 provinces in Canada. This is the average GDP per capita, the living standards in the 50 states in the US on average. And then we have the living standards in those 4 countries which are in Europe but outside the European Union. Quite interesting to look at it this way, I think. And then another thing is this. You can't really conceive of the United States as just one country. It is really 50 countries. And what is interesting is not to compare Louisiana or Mississippi with Sweden. What is interesting is to compare the Nordic economies in the United States and Canada with the Nordic economies in the northern Europe. That is to say, a few provinces and states of the US, and that's what I did. I picked here Minnesota, South Dakota, and Manitoba, because they are Nordic economies. They are inhabited by Nordic immigrants to a large extent. And then I compared the living standards there with Sweden, Iceland, Denmark, and Finland. I left out Norway because that's oil-rich and doesn't count, and I left out also North Dakota and Saskatchewan for the same reason, that the oil there skews the picture. You can't really make a meaningful comparison when you have an oil-rich country like those 3 are. Now let us then see what the living standards are in those rather similar American countries and Nordic countries. In Minnesota, we have the GDP per capita in 2010 over $50,000. In South Dakota, in Manitoba, we have also good living standards. In Sweden, we have this. In Iceland, this. Denmark, this. And Finland, this. So we have those 7 Nordic economies, and of them, the North American Nordic economies score much higher than the Nordic countries. So much for the Scandinavian countries having created better societies than those societies in the US, which are largely comparable with the Nordic countries, namely Minnesota, South Dakota, and Manitoba. Now, once Milton Friedman was having a talk with a Swedish economist, and the Swedish economist said to him, well, you see, in Sweden, we Swedes, we really do not have any poverty. And Friedman responded, yes, that's interesting. The Swedes in North America don't have any poverty either. And that's very interesting. Let us compare Swedes in Sweden with Swedes in North America. Because those figures actually, they do exist. Here are Swedes in Sweden, then we, for a comparison, have the average US citizen, and then Swedish Americans, and see what their income is. because there we have the same group, but in two different societies, one of them living in Northern Europe and the other one living in Northern America. And the Swedes in Sweden, they had in 2008 $38,000 on average in GDP per capita. The average US had 48,000, and the Swedish Americans had 58,000. Same nation, two different societies, two different economies, much more productivity, much higher living standards in the Northern American model than in the Swedish model. And then another comparison which is very interesting, if you look at Angus Madison's figures, is to compare same societies, well, same nations, or similar societies, but the different paths that they've taken. Some have then taken the path of socialism, others have taken the path of capitalism, and those figures are all in official statistics on the internet. That's the point of my talk, what a fountain of facts we can have here to support the liberal position. We can, for example, compare 4 Chinese economies, mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore. We can compare 2 very similar countries in some ways, Australia and Argentina, both inhabited by immigrants from Europe, both from the southern hemisphere, both with the same or similar kinds of natural resources, both European. And then we have 2 tropical islands, both of which were English colonies, small islands. They're interesting to compare, and then to compare, say, 2 Latin American neighbors. And I did a few comparisons of this kind. Because when people are talking about the Chinese economic miracle, they mustn't forget that China is only one of the 4 Chinese economies. There are other economies which are Chinese as well. And let us therefore compare their living standards. Then we see that Singapore is actually has one of the highest GDP per capita in the world, and Hong Kong as well. And both of them have higher. These are Chinese economies. Both of these Chinese economies have better living standards than the US. And then we have Taiwan, and then we have the European Union, and Taiwan has higher living standards than the European Union. And then here we see China. So I say the real Chinese miracles are the miracles of the capitalist China that we have in Singapore, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Then, of course, many people in South America, they are familiar with these graphics I'm going to show here to you. In 1929, Australia and Argentina had more or less the same GDP per capita. They were as rich, both of them, they were, and with the same natural resources, with the same endowments, white immigrants, European, and so on. And let us see what happened to those countries. Here we see what happened to those 2 countries. Argentina, very slow progress. Australia, natural growth. Very interesting 2 different paths. And then Jamaica and Singapore, as I said, 2 islands, both English colonies, both in the tropics, different paths. Here is Jamaica, here is Singapore. Different paths, similar circumstances. And then you can compare things in many ways. One way would be, as I did here, you can endlessly continue doing this, but that's the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis has very interesting tables about living standards relative to US living standards. How far you are catching up with the US, which after all is the main criterion for most people in the world. And we can do that with Chile and Ecuador. And you can see here that Chile actually has been catching quite quickly up with the US. This is GDP per capita relative to US GDP per capita. But Ecuador, to take another typical South American country, has not. It has gone down. The gap between Ecuador and the United States has been widening, whereas the gap between Chile and the US has been narrowing, very clearly. And then you have, of course, the Berlin Wall was mentioned here this morning, and now on the 9th of November next, there will be 25 years since the Berlin Wall fell, and it's particularly interesting because we have the same country in different paths, east and west Germany. Here we have West Germany and East Germany in 1950. They had the same GDP per capita, those two countries. And then we see what happened in the course of 38 years. The difference is quite remarkable between those two. And another comparison is that after the Korean War, both North and South Korea had the same GDP per capita. And look what then happened. South Korea increased, but North Korea did not. And these figures are actually from 1985. So what I did to make the contrast even bigger was to take figures that reached closer to our age, and from Angus Madison's resources website, and there it becomes much clearer. Here is North Korea, and here is South Korea. And this really illustrates what we can see here, and many of you have seen, and this is published on the internet. You know, this spot of darkness. No wonder. Then we come to our friends on the left. I think that we can identify, I was identifying two very interesting, creative, modern thinkers on the right, if we can use those words, left and right. I use them as a shorthand. And those were Matt Ridley and Neil Ferguson. But if I have to identify the most interesting, challenging thinkers on the left, I would say that they were John Rawls on the one hand and Thomas Piketty on the other hand. And Rawls, he makes the poor his main focus. He was the old prophet of the left, and his main proposition is really that income distribution is just if the poor are as well off as they can be. In other words, if we can maximize the minimum, the maximum rule. And I think actually that the Indus of economic freedom can very well respond to Rawls' challenges is because the living standards of the poor are better in the free countries than they are in the unfree countries. Under Rawls, let us say that the income of the poor is very similar in the two countries A and B, but slightly better in A than in B. Let us say that. Then Rawls would have to say that country A was a better country, a juster country than country B, because the income of the poor was better in country A, even if the income distribution is much more uneven in country A than in country B. And the reason is that for Rawls, the main point is that prosperity is shared in such a way that the worst off, they are as well off as they can possibly be. And they are better off in A than in B. It's very interesting to observe this. And if you look at the figures on the Index of Economic Freedom, then the worst off are actually much better off in the freer economies than they are in the unfree economies. So that would fulfill Rawls' criterion quite well if we would go back to the results of the Index of Economic Freedom. But Thomas Piketty, who was just published his book, Capital in the 21st Century, he is not interested in the poor. He seems only to be interested in the rich. He seems to be one of those people whose sleep is deprived at night if he knows of somebody who is making a profit. And that's a totally different approach from that of Rawls, this new prophet of the left. His main proposition is that his data shows that the poor do not gain from capitalism. All the capital accumulation, as he would say, as Marx said, was appropriated by the rich. And what the government had to do in response to this is to expropriate the rich, which is precisely the clarion call of the Capital of Marx in the 19th century. There's a famous sentence there, expropriate the expropriators. And he has a very interesting top incomes database, which I have been studying a bit. and it's all available on the internet. And the Financial Times published yesterday, actually, or the day before yesterday, a critique of it, where it seems to be that some of the data has been either manipulated or wrongly transferred from original sources to those of Piketty. But I'm not entirely sure that it does really matter for his main challenge to classical liberalism and to capitalism. I think that his information is useful, even if inadequate. And his main point is that the income share of the 1% top income in several countries all show the same tendency. But if you look at this graph very carefully, then you see that the share of the top 1% in the 19th century was much higher than it is now, and that it went down before the welfare state. So it must have gone down because of, not natural, but because of historical trends, not because of government action, because there was no government action to counteract the decline of the share of the top 1% before the redistribution welfare state came along, and that only happened in the 1930s, 50s, and 60s. So we see that there isn't really a very strong correlation between redistribution and the share of the 1% with the top income. And there may be actually natural factors or market factors causing the rise in the share of the 1% now, and it may be in a way a statistical illusion. But it's very interesting to see that the very graph that you can produce out of Piketty's research do not really strengthen his claim that we need a very strong redistributive state, because it is not redistribution that had anything to do with the tendencies that you can read from his statistics. And then I went into the databases and I said to myself, well, isn't this really the problem that the people who live on the Avenue Foch in the 16th arrondissement in Paris, they are now enjoying a better life than they did 30 or 40 years ago? Is that what they should be really concerned about? Shouldn't we be concerned about the workers in India and China who were dirt poor 30 years ago? And what I did was to go to his databases and look at the income of the rest of the population, that is to say the 90% in China, which are not in the top 10, but just the ordinary workers in China. And here you can see this. And I think that this actually explained to a large degree why the incomes of the lowest income groups in the West have not risen as rapidly as the incomes of the highest income groups in the West. It is because of competition from workers in China and India, who basically meant that the wage increases in the West have leveled off for a while. But then they will take off again because we are enjoying much cheaper products from China, and they also constitute a market in the future for our goods. But this is the most remarkable graph, in my opinion, that you can gather from Piketty, not the one about the rich. And we must never forget either, the rich are rather unpopular. Few of us are rich, and they are a minority, and Aristotle worried that democracy would be used to expropriate the rich. Aristotle basically said that democracy was a dictatorship of the poor, where they abused the government in order to get to the rich down. But the rich contribute most of tax revenue. And what would happen if they would leave us, the rich? Would the tax revenue continue to be there? Let us say that here in this room there would be 5 rich people and the other one would be rather poor. And we had a society, and then the 5 would just leave. They would just emigrate. Would we have the same tax revenue after their immigration as we had before it? I'm not sure about that. And then the interesting thought experiment is if they wouldn't emigrate but just disappear. And that's what Ayn Rand actually pointed out as a possibility, and Atlas Shrugged. A very interesting thought experiment, the benefits from the rich. And then if we just turn to the data, having Atlas Shrugged in mind, the proportion of total tax payments. The lowest quintile, the lowest 20% of the taxpayers, You look at their contribution to the whole tax burden. And then the next lowest is here, the mid quintile, the next highest quintile, and the highest one. It is the rich who pay most of the taxes that individuals pay. That's something that we have to remember. And then we have the Reagan experiment. Reagan, as everybody knows, lowered the marginal tax rate of the rich. When he was president from 1981 to 1989, the number of rich people, defined as people who had more than 200,000 US dollars in annual income, was much higher. There was a great increase in the number of rich people. The number of rich people are on the left axis. Here is their increase from 1980 to 1988 under Reagan. So they increased it a lot. But what about the tax revenue? Even if, don't forget that he decreased taxes. He decreased marginal tax on the rich immensely. And that's what Piketty and everybody else has been criticizing him for. But the tax revenue, which is on the right axis, went up immensely. This is what happens if we increase the number of rich people and if we allow them to be rich. They contribute more to society. So I've been just going around the internet and telling you what kind of information is available from all those interesting websites. I would actually say, like an Austrian, because I was brought up in the Austrian tradition, I did my doctoral dissertation on higher, that you have to take these statistics and, cautiously. They are not the end of everything, every argument. They can be quite, we are not always sure what they are telling us. They are numbers, they are not real phenomena. We have to realize that. That is the Austrian insight. But nevertheless, they are quite interesting. And I think that when we look at the challenge, it is really to try to reduce poverty by economic growth. And here we can see the development over the last few years of the contribution of various countries to the gross international product. We see that the European Union produced in 1992 more than 25% of the total world product. The US produced then slightly less, but and has also declined relatively, the US, although it is about 17 or 18% of world product. We see, however, that China and India have increased immensely. You can see how interesting this is. And it is not only interesting theoretically, it is such a challenge for us. There is the challenge. China and India are challenging the European Union and the US and Brazil. Because they have had such economic growth. Even if we want to stand still and don't want to participate in the race, in the competition, we have to, otherwise we will end up at the end. And I think the challenge for Brazil is that its share in world production has been going down, even if it could go up with the enormous resources that that Brazil has had, and Brazil has showed the capacity for a few years to introduce monetary stability and financial stability. So it is not at all impossible for Brazil to have economic growth. But I think this should be worrisome for any Brazilian, because the challenge for Brazil is to keep up with the rest of the world, especially with China and India. So my closing words here will be is that what Brazil needs is more economic freedom in order to stimulate more economic growth.